Hey guys, what is going on? It's me. I'm here to talk a little bit about one of my favorite films. Earlier today, I spoke about one of my other favorite films, Braveheart, and the anniversary of that historic event depicted in that film, starring Mel Gibson, about the life of William Wallace. And in the video as well, I discussed the anniversary of the birthday of Cesar Chavez, Mexican American leader, and Mexican American musical icon Selena is also coming up. The anniversary of her passing is coming up. But the director of Selena, Edward James Olmos, this movie that I'm about to talk about was his first foray into movie direction. He loves to make films about Mexican American culture. He loves to make films about Mexican American history, and that's just what he does in this one. And it is on the 13th of March. It was the 30th anniversary of the release of this film. Um, it came out March 13th, 1992, and it's American Me, starring, of course, Edward James Olmos as the main character of Santana. Santana is a Mexican American youth growing up in the northern part of California, Bakersfield, and his parents were a victim of racial violence in 1943, the Zoot Suit riots, an incident that really occurred in history when Marines on leave from World War II beat up a bunch of kids wearing, you know, really fashionable, stylish suits at the time, Zoot suits. Many will recall Zoot suits were also featured in another 1992 movie in Malcolm X because it was the style of the 30s and 40s that a lot of kids wore. Not only Mexican Americans, but African Americans and Filipinos as well were victims in this riot. This happened in California. So Santana's parents were part of this. So he's growing up in the 1950s and he is influenced by street gangs. He's growing up in the La Primera Flats area in Bakersfield, California. He has his little group with his friend JD and another kid. Now, what makes JD different is JD is Caucasian. He is not Mexican American, but he grew up in the Mexican American culture, the Mexican American neighborhood, and he has the Mexican American typical street accent, typical Chicano accent. There's one scene in the movie where he's like, "All we gotta say is our barrio, our clica," you know, and when they're putting the tattoo on him for his gang. So long and short of it, the kids get arrested and they go to the CYA, the California Youth Authority in Tracy, and they have to form a group together, a mega gang, not just their gang in their streets, the La Primera flat streets, but all the Mexican Americans, because they see the African Americans banding together, they see the white kids banding together, so they themselves have to band together on the basis of race and form a gang, mega gang, if you will. Now, JD, the kid JD, has a problem, a conundrum in this, because he is, of course, he's biologically, genetically, he's a white kid, but he acts Mexican, and the white kids confront him. They say, where you from? That's a common thing in California gang culture. Where you from? You know, uh, he says, I'm from La Primera, East Los, East LA. They say, well, you sound like a fucking Chacon, right? They tell him, well, he sounds Mexican. Why does he sound like that? They reject him. And the Mexican kids, they're like, the one fat kid, Big Happy, he goes up to Santana and he's like, but he ain't Mexican, Holmes. He said, what did I tell you, USA? He's my best crime partner. you know? So JD becomes part of the gang, and the gang becomes even bigger. They become adults to where they move into the Folsom prison, and they start to take over everything, including the drug trade. There is this one powerful scene where they burn somebody in their cell for doing something illegal to them, stealing from their drug pot, and they burn the guy in the cell alive. They are becoming, they form the Miami, the Mexican Mafia, and they're becoming the biggest gang in all of Folsom Prison and San Quentin, all over the state of California. And Edward James, almost part of Santana, matures into an adult. Eventually, he gets out and he wants to make his life better. He wants to, become a better citizen. Not do the things he was doing before. He wants to turn his life around, but he just can't. His girlfriend, somebody he hooks up with, he says to him, "You're like a kid. You never did this. You never did that. You don't know how to dance. You've never had sex. Conventional sex anyway. You know what I mean? um, you have a virgin mindset, yet you're this ruthless killer, this ruthless gang leader. So, but he sincerely wants to turn his life around. But by this point, when he gets out, he's too in it. His gang is too large. They've now spilled into the streets. They've flooded the entire Southern California with drug, particularly dope. So yeah, he goes to war with the Italian mafia, La Costa Nostra, and in one scene, one of his guys rapes an Italian mafia member, one of the Don kids or sons or whatever, in prison. Really graphic stuff, just like the earlier scene where um, Santana himself got raped. Really graphic shit. Like one of the most graphic prison movies up to that date that had ever been released. And it is a good movie. Now, by the end of it, he fails to turn his life around. He gets reincarcerated, and he is set up to the point where he is stabbed, thrown off the tiers, and each time he goes down in the tiers, they stab him each one more time. They stab him like 50 or 60 times in the movie before killing him. Now, how does that compare to real life? Well, what really happened, the real story, it is based on a true story, but the real story is a little bit different than what is depicted in the movie. In the real life story, it is based on the life of a man named Rudy Cheyenne Gadena, also a young man from Bakersfield, California, also um, one of the founders of the Mexican Mafia of Miami, also dies that brutal death that he dies. What are some of the differences with how he is depicted versus how Santana is depicted in the movie? Well, one of the biggest differences is that he is not ever raped. According to what the people in the Mexican Mafia, they actually got upset about this. They actually, tried to kill Edward James almost over this because he depicted the leader of the Mexican Mafia getting raped and people in the Mexican Mafia engaging in rapes of other people, particularly him getting raped. Now, there is an incident when Cheyenne Gadena was in the CYA, in the California Youth Authority, in the late 1950s, where somebody went up to him and kissed him on the forehead and told him that he'd be his prison bitch. That and he goes on to kill the guy, but the guy doesn't rape him. The leader of the Mexican Mafia, Cheyenne Gardena, never got raped. Another difference with reality, according to what they say. The Mexican Mafia themselves never ordered the hit on Cheyenne Gardena as is depicted in the movie. Actually, the people that ordered the hit was the Nuestra Familia, their rival faction. The Nuestra Familia forms in the late 1960s, particularly 1968, after what is called the Shoe War. Somebody from the Mexican Mafia, um, Robert Salas, steals the shoes of a man named Hector Padilla, who is unaffiliated, and that sets off a war. And then on September the 16th, 1968, on Mexican Independence Day, the Nuestra Familia, this new faction formed of Mexican American, Hispanic American inmates, splits away from the Mexican mafia, and they become forever immortal enemies, with the Mexican mafia repping the color blue and with the Nuestra Familia repping the color red. Now, they don't show that in the movie. They do show some animosity between Hispanic inmates as they become more prosperous and as they become to grow. The Mexican mafia begins to grow, and they show there's some animosity with them. Particular one scene where this guy gets stabbed up while we're watching Woody Woodpecker, and another guy gets stabbed up while they're lifting weights. Pretty brutal and graphic stuff, but is not. They never show the northern side. They never show the Nuestra Familia side. They never show that end. It's completely about the Mexican mafia. You know, once that happens, once they split away from the Mexican mafia, from La M, you never again hear about the NF. You never hear about Nuestra Familia ever. You know what I mean? And of course, Nuestra Familia is a formidable opponent against um, the Mexican mafia all throughout, California prison history since that time, since the 60s. Um, so it's pretty weird you don't hear ever about them. You don't hear necessarily that it really wasn't. It's made out to be now, and nowadays, when you read about it and you learn about it, it's made out to be a geographical divide. Like the people in Northern California represent the red, they represent Nuestra Familia, and people from the South represent La M, the blue, the Southerners versus the Northerners, the Norteños versus Sureños. That is something that is made out to be, but in reality, in real history, most of the founders of the Nuestra Familia branch, or the Blooming Flower, or Familia Cinco, or was originally La Familia, just La Familia Mexicana, originally were from the north of California. Even a relative of Shine Gardena, Chalo Hernandez himself, because Shine Gardena, here's the ironic part, here's the odd part. Shine Gardena is himself from Bakersfield, California. Now, Bakersfield, California is the cutoff point between the territories and the gang world of the Norteños and the Sureños. Still, but he's from Bakersfield, California. So his cousin Chalo Hernandez was from Bakersfield. A lot of them were from LA, a lot of them from Santa Barbara. In fact, one of the first premier generals in the Nuestra Familia, a Puerto Rican Vietnam vet, Robert Babo Sosa, was himself from Santa Barbara, California. So you don't hear about that any of that in the movie. All you see is them calling them fameros, which is a diss to the Nuestra Familia. It's like when the Nuestra Familia calls La M scraps. It's a diss to them because in California it's the opposite of the East Coast. In the East Coast, the North is very the North is very the North is very industrious, and the South is very rural. In the West Coast, the South is the rural part, and the North is, the South is the urban part, the industrious part, like LA, like San Diego, you know, even Pasadena, those areas. They're very industrious, big cities and stuff. While in the north, Oxnard, Bakersfield, Stockton, Salinas, which is the head of that, basically the headquarters of the Nuestra Familia, right? The NF is basic. San Jose is basically more rural, so it's the complete opposite of the East Coast. Like here in the East Coast, of course, New York is very urban. New Jersey is Trent. The cities in New Jersey are very urban. The cities in Connecticut, there are cities in the South that are very urban, but the South is more rural. We call them country for a reason. Even in our Civil War, the urban and rural divide played a role into how we won, why we won. You know, but with them, they call them farmeros. They diss them, crop busters. That's where that comes from. And They don't really show that here. They don't delve deep into the Nuestra Familia and war between the surrenders, and that really got the Mexican American, um, the Mexican mafia really upset with Edward James Olmos to the point where Edward James Olmos wanted to kill, um, they wanted to kill Edward James Olmos. Members of the Mexican mafia, in particular, um, Joe Joe Pegleg Morgan, who the character of JD is based on. Joe Pegleg Morgan in real life was a white American, a Croatian American, grew up in East LA, grew up as a Mexican American, and was one of the founders of Landmate. Not one of the original founders, according to, um, some people. Um, Kilroy, Kilroy, the late Kilroy, Ranho, he was like, no, Joe Morgan was not one of the founders, but Joe Morgan is considered basically one of the founders. He's the reason. His alliance with the Aryan Brotherhood is the reason why today the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood are like this in the California prison system, just like the Black Guerrilla family and other subsequent black gangs like the CCC and the UBN, the United Blood Nation, are allies with uh, Nuestra Familia, all the black gangs. Originally, at that time, was the Black Guerrilla family, headed by W.L. Nolan and George Jackson. George Jackson, of course, a famous author. He wrote Blood in My Eye, he wrote Soledad Brothers, and he's behind the San Quentin Six. But people say nowadays, according to reports, that ironically enough, the Black Guerrilla family doesn't exist on the West Coast anymore and completely died out with the rise of other gangs, particularly Bloods and Crips. But um, that the Black Guerrilla family does exist in Baltimore. I don't know how true that is. I don't live in Baltimore, but they don't really show the Black Guerrilla family in here. They don't really show the Aryan Brotherhood, aka the Brand, aka Alice Baker, which at that time was called the Bluebird Gang because they put glass in their teeth, so they earned the nickname the Blue Blood and the Bluebird Gang. They don't show T.T. Bingham or um, you know any Thomas Silverstein or any of the founders of the Aryan Brotherhood either. They don't show George Jackson or W.L. Nolan. None of those guys in American Me. It's just alluded to. Names are changed to protect the innocent, but it doesn't protect the innocent. One of the things Edward James Olmos, one of the actors in it, Danny Trejo, a guy who was locked up in San Quentin with the founders of the Mexican Mafia. He said, well, why did you put that in there? And Edward James Olmos says, well, I wanted to make it more theatrical. Right? He says, but you're not dealing with theatrical motherfuckers. you know, in other words, he wants to tell these stories, these unknown stories of Mexican American culture, and good for him. You know what I mean? But this is not like telling La Bamba, the story of the life of Richie Valens, or this is not like telling the story of Selena, or this is not like the movie with uh, Michael Pena, the Walkout, 1968 Walkout with the teacher Sal Castro in East LA. It's not like that. It's not like La Familia, that movie with Jimmy Smits and J Lo. This is a movie that is dealing with some heavy stuff with regards to Mexican American culture and with regards to prison gang culture. These are heavy dudes. These dudes will put a hit out on you and will think nothing of it. The first prison gang formed in American history, really. And Nuestra Familia, the second prison gang formed in American history. But I just find it interesting because this is a part of um, American film history that people don't really talk about. And the fallout and the ramifications that happened from it, after the movie was released. Now, in 1993, another movie came out, Blood In, Blood Out, that was very similar, starring Benjamin Bratt and Damian Chapas. And a lot of people like this version better because they say that this version is more comical, which it is, and it shows, Delroy Lindo as basically George Jackson and um, You know, they show like members of the Aryan Brotherhood, maybe Michael Thompson or whatever, like as Big Al. I don't know. I'm not familiar with a lot of the luminaries that founded the AB or any of the names that really founded the AB. I know Clayton Fountain is one of them, and Tyler T.T. Bingham um, is another, which is ironic because T.T. and Thomas Silverstein, of course, is one. You know, but their names are changed as well, and the names of the gangs are changed. The Vatos Locos instead of say White Fence, or instead of um, Oyo Maavia, or some of the older Chicano gangs from the early 1900s. Those gang names are changed, and Vatos Locos is put in place, and instead of La M, you have La Onda, which is kind of similar. And but again, in Blood Out, who murders Montana, who is like the Santana character, it is his own side. They don't show they don't even show a split between the two Hispanic factions. All you have is a Hispanic faction, a black faction, and a white faction. You know, you know what I mean? So even with that, you're trying to show racial tension, but you have to show a key component of that, I think, is to show the North and the Southern side. You know, what happened in the North, the fact that most of the Nuestra Familia people that formed it were from the South, except for like, I think it was Black Jess, one of the original members. He was not a Southerner, you know. He was not a Southerner. He was a Northerner. Hector Padilla, also the victim of the shoe wars, he was a Northerner as well. And eventually, the cards fell where they fell. Now, good books to read on this. People will say no, they don't read these books because these men are snitches. They're telling all the history or whatever. But again, I am not a gangster. I am just a fan of history. I'm a fan of literature. I'm a fan of film. I'm not a gangster. So I I'm not even from California where these gangs exist, where these allegiances exist. So I don't take sides when it comes to this. Like if you watch Saving Private Ryan, right? Of course you're going to root for the Americans. If you're an American, you're not going to root for the Germans, but you're not going to get mad if somebody told the German history, somebody told the Nazi history. You're not going to get mad if somebody told about the Desert Fox Rommel, or somebody told about Hitler. You're not going to get mad at that. You're not going to get mad if somebody told about De Gaulle or Churchill or Roosevelt, right? You're not going to get mad if you watch Braveheart and somebody doesn't tell the correct story of Edward the First, you know, Edward Longshanks, or uh, Robert the Bruce. They don't really tell that Robert the Bruce and William Wallace were from nobility. They make it out like they were commoners. They tell a false narrative that Edward the First was trying to have all the Scottish women get married to English noblemen. That never happened. And they don't tell the backstory of why Edward the First was trying to take over England in the first place. So just like with this, you shouldn't get mad if books are written to correct what the movie is saying. It's better to have books written to be correct what the movie is saying than to actually have freaking, people killed and emotions running high about the freaking movie. There are movies now being told about the formation of the La Costa Nostra, the American mafia, as well. Movies about Lucky Luciano, movies about Meyer Lansky, movies about, um, you know, um, Arnold Rothstein, movies about Bugsy Siegel when he founded Las Vegas. You know, nobody gets mad at that. Nobody gets mad about George Morano or Al Capone or any of this stuff. Even stuff about New York gangs. Like OG Deadeye, OG Mac, or King Blood, or King Lord Gino. Latin Kings like New York and Midwestern gangs. Jeff Fort, Larry Hoover. You know these people. The stories of Freeway Ricky Ross. Nobody gets so. There are books written. Um, a very good book is The Black Hand by Renee Boxer Enriquez. Another one is a book by John Mendoza, The Shifting. I think it's called The Shifting Paradigm. That's another one. It's not really written about the movie itself, but it's written about these events. And the one other one by John Mendoza, The Rise and Fall of the Nuestra Familia, you can look that up here on YouTube. And there's so many channels written by produced by Sureños and Norteños telling their sides of the stories with the wars. And to me, as an East Coast person and a movie buff, and getting involved with this part of Chicano culture and this part of Mexican American culture, because we learn so much about white history. We learn about the George Washingtons and the Abraham Lincolns and and all the presidents and everything, which I can name them all. We've seen a video on that, right? We learn so much about Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, the war between the North and the South, black slaves. But when it comes to Latinos, an ethnic group that, besides Native Americans, were the first ethnic group here, and the fact that many Latinos do have indigenous ancestry, right? They have ancestry from the Mayans and the Incas, especially Mexican Americans. Mexican Americans, the reason why they call them Mexican Americans is because the ancient name, the Nahuatl language of Mexico is Mexica. You know, we don't really learn about that. All we learn about is Cortez conquered the Aztecs, and that was it. They became Mexicans, and they revolted against the Spanish in the 1820s. And after that, in 1910, they had a revolution uh, led by Pancho Villa, and that was it. And they're a poor country, and Mexican immigrants are constantly pouring in across our borders in Salina, but we never really learn about the Mexican American experience. Not to say that gangs are a huge part of it. Gangs are a huge part of it. Gangs are not the only part. Gangs are not necessarily important, or they don't contribute necessarily to society, but it's a part of culture. It is a part of the experience of the people. Just as uh, black organized crime is a part of the black experience. You can talk for all day long what you want about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad or Malcolm X or Noble Drew Ali or Marcus Garvey, but you cannot take away the contributions of a person like Bumpy Johnson or a person like, um, Frank Lucas or Frank Matthews or even Alpo. Being people don't like him, he's a snitch, but these people contributed in their own way in the underworld of culture. You don't like gangsters? People say, "Oh, well, I don't like gangsters. I think they're degenerates, and I think they're outlaws, and I think they are bad people. So why would I want to watch a gangster movie, or why would I want to watch something like that?" You watch Breaking Bad all day, right? You watch The Sopranos all day. You know what I mean? You watch freaking Boardwalk Empire about the life of Al Capone and the formation of the commission and the early mafia during Prohibition. You watch that all day. You know what I mean? So you don't. You will sit there, and the hypocrites will sit there and say that Julius Caesar is just as much of Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus are just as much valid in history as Al Capone and Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky is just as much as part of the formation of Israel as David Ben Gurion, right? People will sit there and say that. People will say, well, Meyer Lansky contributed so much to the Irgun and the Palmach, the Jewish Resistance League against the British and the Palestinians. So he counts and he's valid. But people in the Hispanic culture and like it is depicted in American Me, like the Mexican Mafia or Nuestra Familia, Babo Sosa, or Buff Flores or Rudy Gardenia, they don't matter because they're just gangsters. So you can't put them you can't put them, you can't study their lives and try to appreciate their lives for what it was because they were gangsters and outlaws. Well, I have news for you. The American revolutionaries were gangsters and outlaws. John Brown was a gangster and outlaw. William Wallace was a gangster and outlaw. When William Wallace died in 1305, August 23rd, 1305, at the hands of Edward the First, Edward Longshanks, he was considered an outlaw by the people that he was killed by the English government at that time that was trying to occupy his land. So don't be so quick to say, 'cause I remember with this teacher, Miss Sorello, I was making a point um, years ago about human psychology. And I made the point about human psychology. I said people are so tribalistic that they get divided over silly things like this was the time of the Subway Series between the Mets and the Yankees in 2000, right? To give you some context. I said people get so divided when it comes to the tribalism of things. It's like street gangs. And she immediately blew off the handle. She immediately said, "Whoa, how can you talk about street gangs? Get out of my class talking about street gangs. That's totally inappropriate." But what I was trying to say, I wasn't trying to glorify street gangs in any way. I was trying to say that it is a valid experience for some of those below the poverty line. It is a valid experience. They contributed in some way to the history of humanity and the history of the United States, whether you like it or not, you know. But she wasn't going to say that because she was Italian American. I'm pretty sure she didn't consider the parasitic mafia, paragons of virtue. But needless to say, if it wasn't for the mafia, we wouldn't have Goodfellas, we wouldn't have The Godfather, we wouldn't have Martin Scorsese movies. So my point is, Americans love gangster movies. They've loved gangster movies since forever, since Little Caesars. Heaven Have Mercy. Is this the end of Rico, starring Billy Robinson? At that time, the original Scarface, starring the original Paul Mooney in 1932, about an Irish smuggler, um, the Cotton Club, Oni Madden, all that stuff. Whitey Bulger, you know. But people will praise these guys, but look at Mexican American gangsters and Latino gangsters and even black gangsters, and they'll say, "Oh, they're bad guys. They're crooks. They're nothing to be studied at, nothing to be sympathized with." The Tukey Williamses, the Raymond Washingtons, the Benson Owens and the Sylvester Scotts, and even the OG Deadeyes and the OG Macs, right? They're nothing to be studied. They're nothing to be sympathized with or looked at in any sort of way. I'm not saying you should them sympathize or look at these people in any sort of sympathetic light. Yeah, they're bad people. But as the Bible says, judge not lest ye be judged. You know what I mean? Don't look at them as they deserve death, they deserve ridicule, and they deserve deridement because they're people too. They have valid stories. Rudy Gardenia was loved by his family. Sure, okay, you can say, well, he inflicted a lot of pain on people, through his drug business, right? It even shows it in the movie. One of the girl's family members dies of a drug overdose because of something that he put out there in the streets, right? And he recognizes, the double consciousness of that. It gets to him psychologically because they say to him, hopefully one of the Italians died because he's at war with the Italians, right? So he says, no Italians in East LA, only Mexican Americans. So, and his girlfriend tells him, your business kills kids, man. That's true. He was a bad person in that regard. I mean, Stonewall Jackson was a bad person in that regard. P.T. Beauregard was a bad person in that regard. Um, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Okay, so you're not going to study the military tactic of a Nathan Bedford Forrest because he was a bad person and he fought on the wrong side. You're going to be that purist You're going to be that Puritan-esque that you're going to discount a whole wealth of knowledge just because you don't agree with it and you feel like studying the life and the experiences of this person um, means that you validate their lifestyle and all their life choices? No, that's ridiculous. That's what I hate about cancel culture, and there's cancel culture on both sides of the political spectrum. But anyway, that's an off-brand rant. Check this movie out. It's a really good movie. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell button to see my next videos coming out. Love y'all.